Yes, we are recording now.
Okay, so how do you want to do this? Are you going to ask questions, or do you want me to just speak freely?
No, please speak, and I will listen. And
Okay.
during some time, I may also ask questions.
Okay.
And yes.
Right. Okay. So Ming-Hsien has
Yes.
asked me to say something about the history of the CASTEP code. So I will attempt to do that, but I will get my excuses in first, which is that I've always had an appalling memory. So I'm sure I'm going to miss lots of bits, but maybe Ming-Hsien will prompt me to fill in all the spaces.
Okay.
But anyway, I will sort of start and we'll see how far we get. Okay. So the story of CASTEP really starts in 1985. I had studied in Cambridge, I'd done my PhD in Cambridge, I'd become a college research fellow at Pembroke College, and up to that point I was a theoretician working in condensed matter, but did really no computation at all. In fact, I had no interest whatsoever in getting very heavily involved in computation. Back then, it was always stated that if you wanted to get an academic job in the UK, you would have to go and work elsewhere for a time. And so I applied to a number of places in the US for postdoctoral positions. And I did a tour at the end of 1984, visiting various places. And historically, of course, the place to go for condensed matter physics in the US was Bell Laboratories, and I visited, I gave a talk there, and they didn't offer me a position. I also visited Richard Martin at Xerox, and also went to Cornell University, which was kind of like one of the centres for condensed matter. And in passing, I think it was Peter Littlewood had recommended to Volker Heine that I also apply to MIT and go and visit John Joannopoulos, who had sort of just become established there. But it was very much a backwaters. I mean, MIT now, everyone says, oh, it's really famous, what a great place to go. MIT firstly wasn't as well known back in the 1980s, and the bit of MIT I was in, which was a theory condensed matter group in physics, was really a backwater where they hadn't tenured a professor for 25 years until they did so for John Joannopoulos. So it wasn't kind of like the obvious place to go, but when I went for my visit, I was just inspired by John and the work he was doing, and although it was computational, I thought, okay, well, I can run a few computer calculations and that will be fine. So anyway, I arrived there, and for the first month I was asked by John to look at cluster structures and think about the way of clusters growing. So I did that. And then it was after about a couple of months I'd been there, John called a group meeting, and he explained that he had been at IBM consulting, as all American physics professors do, and bumped into Roberto Carr, who told him about the Carr-Parrinello method. And as all professors do, then he immediately thought, right, okay, what an opportunity. He flew back to Boston and immediately flew up to Corning. And he had another day's consultancy telling the people at Corning Glass about this methodology, and then came back and called a group meeting. So to put this in context, I mean, John had worked with Marvin Cohen, and so he was one of the early people into density functional theory calculations. He'd set up and was building a group at MIT doing it. So he, of course, knew about the potential of the methodology and saw that the ideas that Roberto Carr was talking about, things that now, of course, are well known as the Carr-Parrinello method, were the ways of hopefully expanding what you could do with density functional theory calculations. I mean, when I'm trying to describe this time to people, you know, who either didn't experience it or were outside the field, I would say that in the early 1980s, you know, density functional theory was proven to do useful things, and basically you could do whatever you liked as long as it was 2 atoms of silicon. I mean, there was a slight exaggeration. You know, John's group were crawling up to 8 atoms, but it was certainly true that there was only a sort of small part of the periodic table that you could do at least a pseudo-potential based calculations on. And so you have this amazing predictive methodology, but very, very limited what it could do. John immediately saw that the car parallel ideas were potentially ways of moving to larger systems, right? And again, to just put this in context, lots of people had been playing with various of these ideas. They've been brought into some of the codes beforehand. So certainly the idea of doing iterative matrix diagonalization rather than explicit matrix diagonalization was well known. Richard Nees and Sverre Freund have been doing this for a very long time. So that in itself wasn't new. The idea that you don't go to full convergence of calculations before you calculate forces and you match them and overlap the processes again was standard in the methodology. And bringing in the idea of Fourier transforms, so using real and reciprocal space. I know for a fact that a group in Edinburgh were already playing around with that. So if you looked, again, if you look back pre-Car Parallelo, then elements of what they put together were being used by different people, but of course what Car Parallelo did was bring the whole things together, so you get all the advantage in one. Okay, and of course it was the most oversold technology in the history of the world. Their first paper claimed that they did a global minimization, which they didn't. I mean, they relaxed the unit cell parameter for a fixed unit cell of silicon, cubic unit cell, and they just basically did a steepest descent. You didn't need any dynamics in it at all. So they were clearly claiming more than the technology actually could do, but they were bringing things together. So John called this group meeting. I remember not being very interested, sitting at the back of the room with all of his students, and then at the end of the meeting I just heard John say, "And you're going to be implementing it." And I thought, I wonder which of John's students are going to be implementing it. And I, at that point, paid a little bit more attention and realised actually that John was pointing at me. And so, very much against any of my particular desires, I suddenly got given the job of creating a new set of codes based on this technology. So it was kind of like 2 or 3 months work to get a very primitive set of codes working. So the first set of codes were restricted to orthorhombic unit cells. They only worked with local pseudopotentials. Of course, back then it was only local density approximation. So everything was reduced down to the simplest possible form, simply as a test of whether actually this technology worked. The people that John had gone to visit at Corning were Mike Teeter and Doug Allen, and they started, again, developing a set of codes. We did have occasional exchange of ideas, so some of the ideas I had about increasing the time step for the dynamics, I shared with them. I hadn't twigged to Fourier transforms because I wasn't a computational person, so they gave me useful information about that, so we swapped things backwards and forwards. And of course that Corning code became the plane wave code a number of years later. Maybe we'll get back to that when we talk about the commercialization of the code in due course, but actually ended up as the foundation that the Abinit code was built on. So that came out of the code that Mike Teeter and Doug Allen created at Corning. Okay. Anyway, so back to MIT. After a couple of months, then we had a set of codes that were working. John, in his sort of previous work, had created some good local pseudopotentials for certain elements. And once the codes were working, then he got a number of PhD students in the group to work with me. So we did calculations on germanium surfaces and reconstruction of germanium surfaces. We did calculations on germanium selenide, again, because they were good local pseudopotentials for both of those that Eugene Tarnow did. And so we were sort of cranking out largest calculations, 30 or 60 atoms on newly installed computers that had just arrived at MIT. And really, I think we were the first group to come out with scientific publications, which appeared in 1987. both the grain boundary work and the surfaces work. The ground boundary work actually started later on when I was at MIT, when I encountered Paul Bristow. So we started that work as well. And then Mark Needles had done the, I think, germanium surface reconstruction. So looking at the dimerization on the 100 surface, so rather similar to the silicon 100 surface. So it was suddenly a range of different science that was being done with those codes. And in fact, many years later, Michele Parinello did say that it was very helpful to them because they didn't actually publish a scientific paper till significantly after sort of early 1987 when our papers came out, that there was this sort of degree of the community not believing that the methodology actually could work and be used for things. They certainly had various issues as they applied it to different systems. So in fact, after the event, he said actually it was very helpful having some science coming out in 1987 showing the methodology actually working and doing science. Anyway, so I was only at MIT for 1 year. I came back to Cambridge, where I had this college research fellowship, and continued to carry on trying to do the work. And it did take quite a number of years before things really started moving in Cambridge. So I had some postdocs, I had some PhD students, and somehow things didn't really move forward very much. We carried on doing some calculations. I did calculations on the 3x3 Takayanagi reconstruction of germanium again because of the local pseudopotential.
3x3, not silicon silver.
It's a family of reconstructions. All right, so you can do three. You can do it basically in 2n+1 unit cells. The 3x3 required us, I think, to do 68 atoms in the unit cell, so that was doable on the computers then, and was the smallest member of the family. So
just as background information, what kinds of computer?
So when I came back, there were Cray computers available nationally in the UK. I mean, Richard Needs, who was already in the TCN group, he had actually spent a year with Richard Martin in Xerox. So already in Cambridge, we did have that set of density functional theory codes that Richard and Sverre Freund in particular were continuing to develop. They were the ones who were, moving ahead with iterative techniques. So there was already a density functional theory expertise within the group when I came back, and but they remained somewhat separate. I mean, there wasn't that much, but certainly there was no code dissemination between the two, although occasionally we would sort of discuss problems and potential ways of solving them. So, with an established staff member in that field, I did get students and postdocs, but things didn't really begin to gel until a number of years later. Then Volker Heine, without actually asking me or my permission or whatever, volunteered this new approach to doing density functional theory calculations to be the flagship project of one of these UK collaborative computational projects. So CCP9 is the one within the remit of electronic structure. When they were set up, the CCPs were meant to have a range of sort of responsibilities. So one was to sort of enable the community. Another one was to sort of maintain existing software as it you change computers. But the other one was to also develop new methodologies. Okay, and so Volker said, we got this wonderful new methodology, this should be a CCP9 flagship project. So that all got accepted and approved. I don't think it was actually part of a grant application. It was kind of like money already available within these CCPs for doing these flagship projects. But he came back to Cambridge and he said, I've got great news. I've got some funding for you to have a postdoc to develop the code. And I said, that's great. And he then said, and then all you have to do is give your code away to everyone. Right. Which was kind of like, all right, okay, well, that's kind of like the rules. But what it did mean is that we did have postdoc support. So we had actually postdoc for a period of time, who very unfortunately was killed in a road accident at the Psy-K Total Energy workshop. That was Xudong Weng. And then Victor Millman volunteered himself to basically take charge of putting together the various, so I guess, people who've worked with me, had done lots of different things, So Björk Hammer was here. He had developed the code to do non-orthorhombic unit cells. There was work on, more generalized pseudopotential. So lots of bits of work have been done, but it was all very sort of scattered. It wasn't in a single code. And what Victor basically did was bring all of these things together into a single unified code, right? And as we were meant to disseminate this code.
What was Victor's original mission?
So he was here as a postdoc, and I guess, I as I say, I have a terrible memory. I really cannot remember what he certainly wasn't working with me. It was possible he was just working with Volker on something or other, maybe all electron calculations, something like that. But he volunteered himself to take on the job of the CCP9 postdoc, basically putting together a suite of codes. So I guess this takes us into either 1990 or 1991, which was when we had the set of codes, all the bits of code brought together into a single code that was now in the state that it could be distributed. And so we do what, of course, is commonplace in electronic structure field, is that you organize a summer school, and at the summer school you tell people about the methodology, but you also give them hands-on experience, and also we gave people the code to be able to go away and do whatever calculations they like. So this school was going on, and I remember being in Volker's office. Richard Neves was there. I'm sure Carol Kuntz was there, and I was there. And I'm not sure who said this, whether it was Carol or someone, but said, you've got this school, you've got all these people learning how to use the code, but you don't have a name of the code. Because up to then it was just, it's our total energy density functional pseudopotential code. We didn't have a name for it. So this must, I think, be the last day of the summer school. It was in the afternoon. It was like, no, you've got to have a name for the code. So I don't know how many minutes it took, and I don't know how many contributions there were from different people, but what we came up with was kind of like a description of what the code was, which was the Cambridge. So CA. S was sequential. Because
sometimes serial appears. So serial or sequential?
Well, I think we called it sequential. Because I think that was more obvious compared to parallel computing in the early days. And then total energy package. And the reason that we put the S in there, well, firstly, it sounds better, CASTEP than CASTEP. But also we had already started engaging with various people on parallelization, particularly EPCC. So already a branch of the code had disappeared off to be parallelized, because we were also involved in this UK Car Parallelo consortium, which was about access to big parallel computers. So there was a sort of a separate stream. So I think simply, given the terminology today, I'm sure that, did we call it sequential? I don't know. It could have been serial. Doesn't really matter. It's the same difference. But that was how the name was generated, and that was a code that we passed on to people. I guess when people say what was the biggest mistake of your life, the biggest mistake of my life was that we didn't get people to sign formal license agreements when they took the code. It was just, you're welcome to do whatever you like with the code, but please do not distribute it. If someone contacts you and says, I want to do this as well, get them to contact us, okay? And it was just, said in a room to these people, and for the most part, completely and utterly ignored. The most extreme example of this being, of course, VASP, which was that stolen CASTEP code, where they simply added the ultrasoft potentials stolen from the car parallel code, and then they created VASP. All right, I think they finally do admit it, but they broke what was an honor code of trust, saying do not distribute. People can come to us if they want the code. That's the truth of it. Everyone knows it. I don't know why this hasn't been stated more publicly. A lot of people have tried to hide the facts. But, I mean, and actually there are numerous other total energy, superpotential, density functional theory codes around, where people further developed the code and then gave it a new name and it became their code. Yeah, that wasn't quite so bad. It was the way that suddenly everyone was using fast, failing to actually acknowledge that it was CASTEP. Okay, and that's kind of like a slightly sore point. So that was the biggest mistake of my life, not demanding. But you didn't back then. You had sort of honour and people didn't misbehave. But that's life. Anyway, so we had CASTEP. We also had the parallel version. It was the early days of parallel computing, and I guess when you look at the development of the field, it was the enabler of parallel computing that really precipitated this to people's attention. Because particularly when you went away from just local pseudopotentials to non-local pseudopotentials and more complicated systems, and there was always going to be a limitation to what you could do on serial or sequential machines. It was the parallel machines that allowed us to do a whole range of absolute world first applications, showing just how much you could do with the technology. Okay, so having done the germanium 3x3 Tachyanagi reconstruction, because that was only 68 atoms with a local pseudopotential, then that was all very doable on big Cray machines. On the parallel machines, we're able to do the Tachyanagi 7x7 reconstruction on silicon, so needing non-local superpotentials. That was a calculation that required 400 atoms in the unit cell, and of course the surface. Interestingly, MIT, John's group, had also developed a parallel code. They worked with, what was the Thinking Machines. So they'd worked with Thinking Machines Corporation, got their codes onto Thinking Machines, and what's the first thing you do if you can do hundreds of atoms and you're a physicist, is you do the Tachyanagi 7x7 reconstruction. So in fact we'd both done calculations on that system.
In the same journal, back to back?
Well, of course that was by agreement. That was by agreement that we would submit simultaneously. Because we were still friends. I mean, I was still interacting with the MIT group, still talking to people. So there's no way that when it was clear that this was the calculation that everyone was going to do. They were the only people on parallel machines in the States as well. So we just had a gentleman's agreement that we would submit simultaneously, and that's the reason the papers were published.
This is readers nowadays. Young people look at the articles. How competitive it was. How can these two big group, world famous group, and the same issue back to back?
Because we weren't going to basically kick each other in the teeth, all right? Because we didn't behave like that, all right? Had it been other groups, then maybe that wouldn't have been the case. So there is a very interesting aside. I said that initially when John Geronopoulos asked me to start setting up the codes, it was really to see what is the potential of this methodology. So at the time, I mean, John travelled extensively around the US, visiting places and so on. One of the interesting things, and it's never ever been fully explained, is that basically, I mean, every condensed matter group in the US, including at Bell Labs, obviously tried out the Carl Parinello ideas, because it was, this would allow you to do all sorts of calculations. And everywhere he went, people said, we tried it and it didn't work. And he would have to say, well, okay, we've actually found that, yes, it does work, and we're able to do some interesting things with it. So I have my own hunch of what happened, but it's never ever been explained why so many groups tried to do this and didn't actually succeed and gave up after a relatively short space of time. But clearly, as more and more things were done. I mean, so as said earlier on, that my joke is pre-1985. Total energy, density functional theory, superpotential calculations were, you could do whatever you liked as long as you had 2 atoms of silicon. And this was very much, of course, the work of the Corning group, Mike Teeter and Doug Allen. I mean, obviously, Corning, glass, what did they want to do? They wanted to do, the silica type materials. So they did calculations for court structures, and they were, very, very accurate. And it turned out that there's absolutely no reason at all why you can't do oxygen or other first-row elements. You just need a lot of plane waves. And the problem is, when you're on very limited computers, you couldn't put enough plane waves in, so you couldn't actually converge the calculation. And it's also fair to say that, of course, the pseudopotentials that were available at that time really paid very little attention to how many plane waves you would need to describe accurately an atomic orbital, and as a result they were very, very hard, and so completely unconvergible. Perhaps if someone had said, oh, maybe we might be able to make a softer pseudopotential, perhaps that breakthrough would have happened before then. But I think it was their 1989 paper, wasn't it, where they did or 88, 89, where they did calculations on the quartz structure and, of course, predicted that perfectly. So, by the late 80s, it was clear that this restriction to, around silicon in the periodic table not being able to do first-row elements, disappeared. And then, of course, immediately, all these people who said, oh, it doesn't work, said, oh, but you can't do transition elements. And that links in, of course, to some of the work that you're involved in, Ming-Hsien, with Dave King, where people started looking at transition elements, and suddenly, it's not that everything was right, but suddenly you were able to find some things where density functional theory worked. Of course, the whole of the decade of the 1980s was really interesting because, of course, in physics, you'd had the density functional theory breakthrough, you had the proof that this really could do essentially predictive calculations. The chemists, of course, were wedded to exact solutions of Schrödinger equation. So, in much the same way of, okay, the physicists could do everything you liked as long as it's two atoms in silicon, the 1981 sort of status of the field. Of course, the chemists could do everything that they liked as long as it was two electrons fixed, right? And that was 1981. Right? And then there was a fun decade where every time you had physicists and chemists together in any sort of meeting with quantum mechanical simulations, it would be, oh, but density functional theory doesn't work, said by the chemists, all right? And then the physicists were saying, well, maybe it doesn't, but, you can't converge your calculations. And so we just basically sniped at each other for an entire decade. I think my most amusing example of that was I was in lunch in college one day, soon after I came back from MIT, and a chemist said to me, oh, what have you been doing for the last year? So I said, well, I've been working on density functional theory calculations. And his only comment was, density functional theory, that doesn't work. 4 weeks later...
Okay, very rude.
No, 4 weeks later, he then came up to me and said, what is density functional theory? All right? So I knew it didn't work, but they never knew what it was. Okay? All right? Right, so what's the end to this particular story? Well, one of the things that we did, yes, with the parallel code, now of course you could do it with this conventional serial code, was that we did the simulations of the dissociation of chlorine on a silicon surface. Okay? So that was with the Kiel group, so Sandro De Vita and Mike Gillen, my postdoc here, who was working on the parallel code.
Ivan Stick?
Ivan Stick, yes, and me. It was the obvious thing to do. You're doing surfaces, you've got dynamics, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to observe a chemical reaction. So there was lots of questions.
I remember when Ivan was giving a presentation, he at that time already linked to the purpose of that simulation will be very useful for semiconductor industry to wash away some chemicals. That is already very...
What we should have done, of course, is done fluorine, because fluorine is by far the sort of more important chemical in processing and etching. But fluorine is particularly difficult element to do, and particularly for density functional theory, it would have been a harder pseudopotential, so you wouldn't be able to do the basis set, but also it's one of these ones which is a very correlated atom, and so probably wouldn't work within density functional theory. So, for lots and lots of reasons, then we did chlorine on silicon. And so we did a whole run, well, not many, we did 5 simulations where we basically took chlorine above silicon 100 surface, 111 surface, which surface was it? 100. And just basically threw the chlorine molecule at the surface in a number of different orientations at different positions on the surface, and just waited to see what happened. Okay, of course, this is only picosecond timescales. I mean, this is one of the Achilles' heels of explicitly doing density functional theory calculations. So, if you hadn't had essentially an instantaneous, reaction, then you've just been stuck with a molecule stuck on the surface. But fortunately, we saw the dissociation process in, I think not all, but most of the simulations. If you want to really get the message across, what you need, of course, is actually to have a video of the process. Of course, there wasn't any software available to create movies of atomistic motion, right? The person who was in charge of our consortium, Dominic Tilsley, who is one of the great heroes for me in the whole of the rise of CASTEP, CTEP and all the rest of it. He headed this UKCP consortium, early adopters of parallel computing in this field, and he wasn't co-author on any papers, he didn't take any credit for it, but he was the person who sort of made sure that things happened, and when we were messing around not getting anywhere, said, look, you've really got to go on and produce some things out of this. So great unsung hero for his contribution to all of this. Did also a lot on the political side, making the thing happen in the first place, and so on. But he was aware that Silicon Graphics were creating some software for doing atomistic movies. So we sent Sandra DeVita off to Basel, I think it was, to work with, I think it was Michael Teichner from Silicon Graphics, to actually use their pre-production software to generate the videos. Baking heard about what we'd done. He invited me over to give a talk to the surface chemistry group. And so it was just like, you put the video in, you just say, okay, well, all we've done is put in atomic numbers, and this is what happens next. And it was like, chemistry happening before your eyes. This is sort of 1991, 1992. So we're doing hundreds of atoms, dynamical simulation, watching a chemical reaction happen. And let's be honest about how far the quantum chemists had got with their explicit solution of Schrödinger equation. Basically, they got to 3 electrons, right? So the physicists had gone from 2 atoms of silicon to hundreds of atoms or whatever, dynamical simulations, actually tons of properties on top. The chemists basically gone to 2 to 3 electrons, right? And although he wasn't there, I have 2 independent witnesses that Nick Handy, who was one of the gurus of quantum chemistry, he was the author of the CADPAC code in Cambridge, was seen in the chemistry labs. He'd obviously heard about this from people, so he wasn't actually at the talk itself, but he was seen the following days walking round the chemistry laboratories in Cambridge, muttering, quantum chemistry is dead, quantum chemistry is dead. And the reality is that within the next 18 months, all but about 1.5 quantum chemistry groups in the world converted over to using density functional theory. Okay, never apologised for telling us that it didn't work, but anyway, so to me that was a pivotal moment, because at that point the competition is lost. Actually, I argued that it had gone far too far the wrong way, because we know density functional theory is always going to be approximate. It's never going to be exact. So of course you need people to stay with exact solutions of the Schrödinger equation, or methodologies that are in principle exact, to complement what's happening with density functional theory. And I think there was far too much of everyone going over everything has been done by density functional theory, and now of course we've seen the rise of a lot of different quantum chemistry or exact methods to complement it, so it's come back. But there is absolutely no doubt, although of course the chemists will never acknowledge it, that was a pivotal thing that meant, I don't dispute they'd all been talking about density functional theory. Yes? I know that Handy and Popel talked about, this density functional theory, maybe you ought to put it in our code, but they hadn't, until there was no choice, because they had made themselves irrelevant if they didn't also have the density functional theory capability in what they did. So, and that was a pivotal thing. Obviously, you need other things as well. I mean, why was there so much argument between the physicists and chemists about density functional theory in the 1980s? Do you know? Let me ask Ming-Hsien. Why did chemists not believe that density functional theory worked? What are the only things that chemists care about?
Maybe those scientists believe hard work will be rewarded and no free lunch. How can reasonably accurate result can come from such fast calculation?
It's a very simple observation, right? Oh. Physicists couldn't care less about the energies, all right? If you're condensed matter physicist, because the energy is infinite, right?
Right.
So all you care about is things like vibrations, things about bond lengths, okay? If you're a chemist, what are the only things you care about in a chemical reaction? The energy, products to reactants, and the barrier height, all right?
Yes.
The local density approximation, for all its faults, gives vibrational frequencies for many things remarkably well. It gives structures remarkably well, and it gives energies absolutely appallingly. So if a chemist tried local density approximation, the results would be rubbish. Hence they'd say it doesn't work, all right? So the movement, the anticipation of density functional theory being important did of course then lead to next generation of density functionals, many of which were worse than the local density approximation, but eventually they kind of sort of half sorted themselves out, and they have sets of functionals that, I mean, there is no such thing as exact functional, all right? This is a stupid thing to go after, but you can develop functionals that are transferable that do a much better job on energetics, and they were a necessary condition for chemists taking all of this seriously. But it was very simple. If you just work at local density approximation, the things that physicists want work, the things that chemists want don't work. Is it any surprise there is a difference of opinion between the two communities? Yeah, but then everything evolved on. I mean, I would, obviously a lot has happened, in the intervening whatever it is, so kind of like 25 years, more than that. But, to me, the sort of the primary elements of, density functional theory calculations, pseudopotentials, it was pretty well all in place by the mid-1990s. I mean, obviously there's lots you can do in terms of adding functionality. You can come up with better density functionals, you can increase capability, you can produce, faster codes, although, that has been much more difficult to push on, compared to when I entered the field. I often do this comparison because I get so annoyed when people say, oh, you just use big computers. When you look at any field in computational science or engineering which is moving rapidly, and there are lots of fields, lots of people have done this analysis, it's pretty well universal. What you will find is that for every factor of 10 performance increase that you got by having a faster computer, a Moore's law driving you, that changes in software and the algorithms and the way that you do the calculations buys you a factor of 100. I mean, you could do the calculation. If nothing had changed from 1981 and we were just using faster computers, I think we would be probably up to about 70 or 80 atoms. All right, you can do the calculation, right? Because it's cubic scaling. I mean, and linear length scales would be hardly changing at all, right? So if it's just driven by Moore's law, you really don't get very much improvement. And this is not just about our codes, it's about every field where you get that burgeoning. It'd be just as true of artificial intelligence, machine learning, just as true of computational fluid dynamics. It's a combination of software and hardware. It's not just driven by hardware on its own. And most of those gains in our field have been arrived at by the 1990s. And And as a result, then of course it has been much more limited because the algorithms haven't gone 1 billion times faster in the last 25 years because there wasn't a huge amount of further efficiency gains, algorithm gains within the basic methodology still to get. Should we stop at that point, maybe, and have a break, and then maybe talk about commercialization?
Okay, yes.
All right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
I hope that's what you wanted.
Yes.
Good.
Yes, exactly. Very good. It's so many insider story.